Hello. In this video, we're going to see properties and inheritance. So continue with the code that we had before. I'm just going to create here in the same namespace. As you see, we can have several classes in the same namespace. I'm going to create another one here. I'm going to call this, let's say, warrior. And I'm going to define warrior as a subclass of hero. So essentially what this means is that warrior is a type of hero and it's going to inherit everything that is defined in the base class, which in this case is hero. So the nomenclature in C# is like this with a column, and then we define the actual class like this, right? One thing that you can see here is that it says that in the base class is less accessible than the class warrior. And essentially what this is saying is that this visibility of this class is public, while the parent is not public. When something is not defined public, it's not public. So if you define this with the same level of visibility, then you can actually define this. Otherwise it wouldn't work. What I'm going to create here, warrior essentially is inheriting everything from the parent class, right? So I could, for instance, have here whichever method I want, something that is let's find something like this. Let's call it something whatever I can imagine. So here I can, for instance, inherit or use the things that are defined in the parent. So I could be, for instance, setting this value for this parameter, this variable, sorry, something like could be a 10. Now this provides an error, and the error has again to do with visibility. And the visibility is that again this variable over here is set to private. That means that only this class can access it. So in order for this subclass to access the variables in the base class, this will have to be either protected or public. Public would be accessible anywhere. Protected would be still private within this class, but accessible for the subclass, right? Now, string is actually a boolean, so that's why it's telling me that is not valid. Okay, and that this would work. So this is one type of inheritance, which is basically the normal inheritance from one class to another. We can also create a different type of inheritance, which is called essentially defining interfaces. So I have here this class, which is actually not a class, this file called ehit. So ehit is an interface. The interfaces by default are public because it made no sense to define a non-public interface. Nomenclature again, normally style says that you should start an interface with a capital E. So interface allows you to define methods. So you could be, for instance, define a method. It could be public, and it could be essentially called hit, right? So now hero is a superclass or a base class for warrior, and now we want this method, this class warrior, also to inherit or to implement interface. So we could have hit over here, not all that, hit over here, and that essentially is telling you that you can inherit from multiple classes. So the error that comes here is basically saying that this is not implementing the interface member. When you have an interface that is implementing something like a method, right? So it defines a method. It needs to be implemented in the class that implements this interface, right? So essentially what this needs is to have that same method over here. You have public void hit. So it needs to be the same nomenclature, and you could be doing here whichever you want to do, right? Let's assume, for instance, that you want to reduce some health points. So you have a variable called health points. Again, this has two issues. One that is private, so we can set it to protect it again. We want to access it from the bottom, and then we might be maybe removing 1 point, right? And notice I have used the keyword base that can be used for accessing members of the parent class, so accessing this this variable over here. I didn't use it before, and that's still fine. This is very useful. Again, same as when we're, for instance, defining variables, the parameters to a method, and we want to differentiate between the member variables and the variables that are passed as an argument. So in this case, it's the same. Here you can specify that this is coming from the base. Okay. We are also going to define here, we're going to see in this video properties. Properties are a specific resource that C# provides you. It's a way to incorporate an extra layer of access and privacy to variables. So let's imagine that we have this class here called timer, and I'm going to define a couple of members. So I'm going to have a double seconds. This is a timer for something that we can be using for time events. And we're going to define here a property. A property, essentially, we normally use it with an uppercase for the first letter. And essentially, the way this looks is we have to call it get and set. And just by having this over here, this defines that seconds is a getter and a setter for the variable that has the same name. So you could be, for instance, in here you could have your own method over here. Let's actually make use of another use of inheritance. So I'm going to define here another variable, and I call it public virtual void. I'm going to call it who am I. So this essentially is telling this is an empty method, and I'm gonna be able to define that in this class. So I can just say, well, I'm gonna be using essentially what this is doing is overriding this method. So if I have a warrior and somebody calls this method over here, this is going to be calling this particular code instead of the parent, right? This code over here that has been automatically added by Visual Studio is essentially just calling the parent. So you could define here some logic that affects all the heroes, while here you could just reusing that, but also adding your own stuff over here, right? So in this method now, I'm gonna note two things important. One is the override, that is a keyword for overriding methods, and the other one is virtual, that allows you to define that this method can be overridden by subclasses. The second thing to say is, well, I'm gonna be using here a timer. So let's assume that this class over here has a timer, and just gonna call it my timer, and then this timer could essentially be used, maybe use it here. So given that, remember, we have just defined this property seconds, I can just set it, and I can do my timer dot seconds equals 10, right? And this call is essentially using the get part of this property, and it's assigning whatever value comes on the right hand side of this expression, in this case 10, is assigning this value to the variable seconds. But you can do something that is even more interesting. So you can define different names for this property. So you could have something like hours, for instance. And now this property hours allows you to define this definition. You could have a get, and you can define actually what happens in the get. So you can say, let's assume that when you call hours, you're going to get return seconds divided by 3,600, right? Or you can define also a set, and you can do that when you call this, when you use this property, the seconds are going to be the value times 3,600. Okay. So this keyword over here is the one that you can use when you use the right-hand side of an expression. So you could be, for instance, setting over here, you could be saying my timer, and maybe you can specify the timers in hours instead of a second. So you could do hours, and then you can say then, I don't know, 24 hours, right? So 24 hours, you are defining this in terms of hours, but then this particular property is actually using that value to define the value, to give a value to the variable seconds, right? And is directly going to be calling this operand, right? Obviously, if you do something like console dot write line, and then you just do my timer dot hours. In that case, this is gonna be calling the getter and returning, computing this expression and returning the value. So it can be useful if you want to provide a simpler way to access and to get and to set values for variables that you have in your class.